I think the most important part of the final rules is that they scaled them back from the proposal. And the headline item, I think, is that they dropped Scope 3 emissions, which are the emissions not of the company, but of their counterparties, customers, suppliers, entities like that.
Joining me today is Mark Kronforst, partner with EY. Mark, thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Now, on March 6th, the SEC issued its long-awaited climate disclosure rule. Could you give us some of your high-level thoughts on that proposal?
Sure. So I think the most important part of the final rules is that they scaled them back from the proposal. And the headline item, I think, is that they dropped Scope 3 emissions, which are the emissions not of the company, but of their counterparties, customers, suppliers, entities like that. That was going to be a significant burden, at least as argued by companies when they responded to the proposal, and the SEC dropped that. They also included materiality in more places in the rules, which allows companies some flexibility to remove immaterial information, because that was a significant concern with the proposal. And then finally, they offered companies more time to prepare. When the proposal came out, the transition schedule was extremely tight, at least the suggested transition schedule. And in the final rules, it's not as tight, that companies will have extra time to prepare.
And when will the final rules be effective?
The final rules will be effective over a staggered transition period. And it'll depend on how large a company is, and it also depends on the topic of disclosure within the rule. So for example, a large company will have to comply with most of the rules starting in 2025. So they would report in early 2026 if they're a calendar year end. Emissions would then come for that company in 2026, and then assurance over those emissions would come in 2029. There's also financial statement requirements. Those would start right away in 2025. And smaller companies then would have more time, and then they're exempted from some of the requirements. The really small companies don't have to report any emissions. So there's really kind of a complicated table that shows you, based on what type of company you are and how large, and the topic of disclosure, you have to follow that schedule to determine when you would have to comply with what.
So with that sort of staggered schedule in mind, what are some of the things that companies should be doing now to prepare?
That's a good question. I would say the number one item that companies should focus on are the financial statement requirements, because the SEC has put requirements in there where companies have to track severe storms and other natural conditions and any expenditures, impairments, and things like that arise from those natural conditions. And that starts on 1/1/25. So companies have to report for that year. But if you think about that they're in the financial statements, that means internal controls are going to have to be in place on January 1st. We are now in March, so it's not a very long timeline. So companies really need to focus in on those financial statement requirements, because those are the ones that are probably going to take a significant amount of time, and they're subject to audit. They're subject to audit of internal control over financial reporting. So it's a lot. It's pretty complex. So companies need to get started on that piece right away.
And finally, shifting gears a little bit, the FASB issued a final accounting standards update on reportable segment disclosures. What is changing under that new standard, and has the SEC expressed a view on what types of measures companies should be reporting in those financial statements?
So the FASB changed a couple of things. I'll highlight a few of them. They put in a requirement to disclose segment expenses. That's not in the current standard. All a company has to do is report a profitability measure, and then there are certain other specified metrics that they have to provide, but no detail on segment expenses. So that's been added. Another thing that they did was they scoped in companies that only have one segment. Those companies had to do nothing under the current standard, and now they're going to have to provide the same disclosures that multiple segment companies will have to provide. The other thing that they did was they provided companies with an option to report more than one profitability measure. Today, or under the existing standard, the SEC will not allow companies to provide more than one measure of profitability. So the FASB standard now includes that option. However, and this goes to your point about has the SEC said anything about what measures can be reported, the measures that get reported are the companies to determine based on how they measure their performance. So if they choose to report another measure, there are some other rules that they have to think about. The FASB just said in their standard, you can report a measure, it's your option, full stop. However, the SEC came over top of that and they said, you can report that measure. However, If you do, and it's not calculated in accordance with generally accepted accounting principles, it's a non-GAAP measure. Now, this creates a bit of a conflict between the FASB standard and the SEC rules, because the SEC rules say that a company cannot put a non-GAAP measure in their financial statements or in the notes to the financial statements. So at this point, a company has to think about, are they comfortable reporting a measure that the FASB says that they can report, but then seems to conflict with the SEC's rules that prohibit those measures from appearing in financial statements. Now, the SEC said, if a company is planning on doing this, to go and consult with them. We don't yet know what those consultations will look like, but this is an issue that companies, if they're planning on reporting a second measure and it's not in accordance with GAAP, they really need to think about whether they want to do this. They also need to get, I think, attorneys involved, securities counsel involved, because these are rules that you could look at and say, if I put that in, yes, I'm complying with the FASB standard. However, I am now violating the SEC's non-GAAP guidance. That's a situation we've never seen before, so it'll be really interesting to see how that plays out.